Hello and welcome to Ficheall.ie, and today we're looking at En Passant. En Passant, meaning in passing in French, is a special chess move that involves an exchange between two pawns. Long ago in chess, pawns were unable to move two places on its first go, so they would gradually work their way up the board and eventually end up capturing each other. So to speed up the game, they introduced the rule where pawns can move two places on its very first go. But this left a problem. The problem was, in a situation such as this one, the black pawn can move two spaces and avoid being captured. So they created En Passant to fix this problem. For white, En Passant occurs when your pawn is on the 5th rank and your opponent attempts to move its pawn two places to avoid being captured. So En Passant is only possible when your opponent moves two places with its pawn on its first go. So let's have a look at how it works. Here, the white pawn is attacking the squares c6 and e6. So the white pawn can capture anything that moves into those squares. Now if black were to attempt to move through this square and avoid being captured, it can be captured in passing, or en passant. The white pawn will move diagonally and capture the black pawn as if it had only moved one place, thus capturing the pawn in passing. Now en passant can only occur immediately after a pawn makes a move of two squares. In this example, if black were to move one square and you chose not to capture it but move a different pawn instead, and black continued moving another square again, then you cannot use en passant in this situation, because en passant can only occur immediately after a pawn makes a move of two squares. In this example, the pawn only made a move of one square. En passant happens rarely in a chess game, but it can cause many disputes amongst beginners, especially where one player is unfamiliar with the rule and might accuse another player of cheating. Now let's look at the same example but from black's perspective. White is attacking both diagonal squares moving forward. If black attempts to move two places and avoid being captured, then white is able to capture the black pawn in passing. So you could say that en passant is an offensive move. Here is another example. In this example, the black pawn is in an advanced position. The white pawn attempts to move two places to avoid being captured, and the black pawn can move in and capture the white pawn in passing as if it only had moved one place. Let's look at it in a game situation. White begins by moving the pawn in front of the king. Black makes any random move next. White advances the pawn and is attacking the two diagonals moving forward. Black attempts to move the pawn two spaces to avoid being captured, but white is still allowed to capture the black pawn by using en passant, as if it had only moved one place. It is important to note that en passant can only occur between two pawns. It cannot happen with any other piece on the board. Here we have the same example again, but this time black moves the pawn in front of the queen two places, but white can capture as if it had only moved one place using the en passant rule. Now en passant can only happen immediately after your opponent moves its pawn two places. So for example, if your opponent moved the pawn two places and then you decide to move your knight, then you cannot use en passant again to capture that pawn. So you must use en passant immediately after your opponent moves its pawn two places. However, in this example, if your opponent chooses to move pawn f7 to f5, then you can use en passant to capture the pawn on f5. This is because you use en passant immediately after your opponent moved the pawn two places. Now let's look at one final example, but from black's perspective. Pawn moves forward into an advanced position and is attacking the two diagonal squares. If white chooses to move the pawn in front of the queen two spaces, black can capture using the en passant rule as if it moved one. If white chooses to move the pawn in front of the bishop two spaces, black can capture the pawn using the en passant rule as if it only had moved one place. Remember, you must use the en passant rule straight away after your opponent moves the pawn two spaces. So for this example, if you decide to move your knight after the white moves the pawn in front of the queen, you can no longer use en passant to capture the pawn in front of the queen. So let's recap. En Passant is an offensive move that only involves pawns. It occurs when a pawn is in an advanced position and your opponent moves their pawn 2 places to avoid being captured by that pawn. En Passant can only occur immediately after a pawn makes a move with 2 squares. You cannot keep it for another go. And you do not have to use En Passant. You can also choose not to capture your opponent's pawn. I hope you've enjoyed our video. Check it out on your chessboard.